As we're facing a troubled world and building a new one as we go, holding each other stronger together, standing as a people so bold.
Welcome, Reverend Stephen Lingwood, and how are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. So I'm really happy to have you here to talk about your pioneer ministry and also your recent stance on the right to protest and how you're bringing that along. But the pioneer ministry is really interesting, so I would just love you to talk to us about what that means to you.
Pioneer ministry is sort of having the starting point being outside the circle. The starting point is not within the circle of church. It's in the community, the city, the network, the neighborhood, whatever it is, and may be based in some ways in the same practices of ministry, of pastoral care and listening and connection. But it's starting with that place outside and a kind of posture of listening, a posture of dialogue, not coming in on day one with lots of plans and schemes, but sort of learning. It's a process of learning because by its nature, it's very open-ended and free and unstructured and letting what emerges emerge as it goes along. But it is really, starting with listening and let something quite organically emerge from that ministry.
And what made you decide to go into this style of ministry? And did you do a lot of research? I mean, how did you know what to do?
There is a kind of body of wisdom about pioneer ministry because it kind of started as a model in around the 2000s, sort of 20 years ago in the Church of England, the Methodist, the United Reformed Church in a UK context. So there is a kind of body of wisdom, but at the same time, it's always about responding to the context, responding to where you are. So it's never about copying a model that's gone well elsewhere. I would very much kind of felt for many years, really, a sort of call to be in this sort of a space, to be in a slightly more experimental and community-centered kind of ministry. There's lots of things I did, certainly, for example, when I was minister of Bank Street Chapel in Bolton, that was engaging. You know, we did the street angels out in the street with people, with picking up the drunk people in Bolton, and that was a great ministry of outreach and work that we did. But you're also aware in a conventional ministry, you're kind of trying to get people over the threshold of the building. You've got a building and you're like, what can you do to get people to come into it? And sometimes you're somewhat successful and sometimes maybe you're very successful and sometimes you're not very successful. I can think of projects I did. We had a series of climate change talks I organised at Bank Street Chapel. And I thought, and there's quite a lot of effort went into that, organising that publicity, that sort of stuff. We had activists come, we had scientists come. I gave some kind of spiritual content. But actually the number of people who turned up from outside the church of that was some, but not many. And I don't want to sort of denigrate any kind of work or ministry in this way, but my thought process is sort of like, maybe I would have had more impact not giving hours to organizing an event and doing the publicity and all that. Maybe if I just gone to the pub for that number of hours and talked to people, that would actually have more impact than doing a thing. And so I think it's thoughts like that have made me think, let me try to work out a way to have a ministry and to work with a community in having a ministry that sort of starts at a different end and doesn't kind of start with the idea of how can we do a thing to get people in a place, but just how can we connect with people and see what happens.
I mean, that sounds that sounds like a fantastic way to change that model. And how does it make you feel the working alone as opposed to working with a congregation and working with trustees?
Well, there's still an element of that. When I came to Cardiff, we kind of had a conversation with the congregation to develop something a little bit different, and that has evolved exactly how that's worked over the years. And so I'm still the pioneer minister for Cardiff Unitarians, and I'm still accountable to the committee, and I also have a mentor that is also part of my system of accountability. So we've tried to build up, structures of connection, accountability, and report writing back into the centre. But it is, by its nature, quite free, quite very unstructured. I mean, ministry in general can be, quite unstructured if you come from a job that's where your boss tells you what to do and you do it. Ministry is you start on day one and you think, oh, what am I going to do? So then there are things you soon get into a pattern of filling the diary when you start a ministry with a church, but there's sort of a sense that there is freedom in it. And there's even more freedom in this model. And it's a matter, I began just going to a lot of cafes, going to a lot of pubs and sort of hanging out and just looking and see what was going on. And that was fine. But then it didn't a few of those places felt like worth returning to, but most of them were just like, okay, I'm just getting to know the neighborhood kind of thing. And then joined a lot of different organizations, and that was really built relationships. And once you start building relationships and going to meetings of organizations, it's slow work. It's because the work of building human relationship is slow work by its very nature. But it begins the kind of tendrils of relationship begin to go out and things begin to happen. And there's kind of trust in the process that things do happen, and they do.
You talked about report writing, and you were very kind to send me one of your most recent reports. And in that, you wrote that some pioneer ministries start with worship and invite people in, and others start with serving and establishing a charitable work that serves the community. And then you say this project has primarily started with social justice, with doing justice work, and then letting community build out of that. So what made you decide to start with the justice work for this project?
I think the first thing I'd say is that I didn't decide to do that. I think it was kind of emerged. I was in a kind of this posture of trying to work out what is the way forward. And at one point I was thinking, is it engaging with the LGBT plus community? That sort of is a fairly obvious thing to do. I'm a member of that community. Unitarians are welcoming to LGBT plus people. And so sort of think, well, maybe that's kind of thing. And maybe I join organizations and go to kind of venues and do that. And for whatever reason, that just didn't seem to be something that took off as a thing. So okay, that's maybe not it's always around in a sense, but maybe that's not the primary thing. But kind of connecting with things like Extinction Rebellion, and sort of I moved to Cardiff at the beginning of 2018. So it was sort of the time when these things were just emerging. There was energy around it. So I think it's things like Extinction Rebellion in Cardiff and other sort of spaces where people are doing activism and reflecting on activism from all kinds of perspectives and causes, that became the relationships and the things that grew in the places where it felt like I could be part of something that contributes. When we had the Extinction Rebellion action in Cardiff in, I think, 2019, we had a great interfaith kind of opening ceremony, which on a kind of lovely summer sunny evening in the park, we kind of held this circle with 8 or 9 different kind of faith representatives to kind of as an opening ceremony for the action that was taking place for a few years in Cardiff. And so it's that sort of something like that. Things felt like they came alive and they seemed to be useful and seemed to be something that was worth doing. And I think doing the social justice first as a kind of model, it's not first exactly because kind of listening and presence is first, but that as kind of the thing that is a center in some sense. I think it, for me, has enabled me, and all of this is a learning curve, to be clearer what the answers are that I and we are providing into what questions. In other words, what are we providing? If we're saying, come to our worship service because it's a nice thing, like what are you actually saying is an answer to a question people genuinely have. People have a genuine need, a genuine question, and you're saying, here's an answer, maybe not an answer, maybe that's too sort of dogmatically sounding, but here's a response, here's something useful, here's a gift for you. This is a gift that you're welcome to take. You're welcome not to take it, but you're welcome to take, in terms of what faith communities or what Unitarian community is doing in the world, is giving to the world, is giving to a place. And starting with social justice kind of has, for me, enabled me to discover rather than kind of provide some of those answers are. And I don't know what all of the answers are, but I have a sense that some of the answers are things like being in a sense of a set of stories of hope. That is something people need when they're doing activism in the world, that they need to have hope and a connection with stories of hope. And faith community provides stories of hope and a feeling of connection, feeling you're not doing it on your own, that you're connected to community and to God, that we are doing this work not in our own power, but through something that works through us in the broadest sense, not just something we're doing because we are good or have the ability to do it. But then you think, oh, maybe I'm not good. Maybe I don't have the ability to do social justice work. Maybe I'm a bit rubbish. But if you feel like, so I think what we can offer is a sense that we're doing something connected with the greater. And another thing is non-attachment to outcomes, which I think is very difficult for activism, because in a sense, of course we want outcomes, of course we want something to change, and sometimes that's life or death. So of course we want justice and peace and change a particular policy here and there. But at the same time, I think the spiritual traditions invite us to go, yes, but actually we have to, in some sense, do the work non-attached to whether we're successful or not. And I think that's a wisdom that helps us to be sustainable in the work, because that means we're more able to live through when we fail, which we often do, because that is the nature of doing justice work, is that it is often failing. We are often not succeeding, and we need to have wisdom of what we do with that.
Yeah, that's, I mean, such an important concept, and that detachment idea is something that can really help us. I think it's really, this is why it's really fascinating, this pioneer ministry, because you obviously are not, you're not working within a space right now. So sorry, we're going to go a little off piece. Just how could you see this working with congregation that has a building and that would want somebody to come back to the building after a certain point?
I think a lot of the same principles can apply to all kinds of ministry and all kinds of outreach. I'm very aware, I think, a lot about what it is to be a host and what it is to be a guest, because in a pioneer ministry context, I'm a guest in my spaces that I'm in. I'm going into other organizations, other communities, other spaces. I'm beginning after several years to create my own spaces and circles, not physical buildings, but beginning to do that. But mostly I'm a guest, and that's, a guest is it being a certain way. There's ministry in being a guest. There's ministry in being a bit powerless and being a guest. And there's ministry in being a host. And sometimes, because I don't have a building and Cardiff Unitarians don't have a building, Cardiff Unitarians meeting the Quaker Meeting House, I don't have the ministry of, you can use our space, talking to an organization. And sometimes I wish I could say to organizations, you can use our space. And so that is a great gift if you are able to have the gift of being a host and having a conscious sense that how are we host to our community, because we have a building. And buildings are amazing in lots of ways. Buildings are a headache in some ways. Buildings are a resource, because when you don't have a building, you realize what kind of a resource that is. That sometimes an organization's like, well, we haven't quite got organized enough to have a budget or a money even to pay £10 to hire a space for. And some organizations where they're just getting going need a little bit of generous space. That takes some thinking about practicalities around all of that. But I think it's relationship building, and then asking the question, when you do have a building, how can we be generous hosts? And there's power in being a host as well. It's also recognizing some ways you were always in a privileged position when you're the host. And sometimes, yeah, I'm aware of there's an advantage in not being in that position, and not saying, look, I'm the great minister, and I'm hosting you because this is my building, and saying, I'm just sort of a guy and I'm just sort of turning up and all I'm offering is my vulnerable humanity and who I am. But there's also there's value in that, because you're witnessing to something else in that as well.
Yeah, that's a really good outlook. I'm wondering because I mean, so I'm not a minister myself. I'm a layperson, and I don't really know much about the training of ministers. And so I'm just wondering, when ministers are trained, do they learn this kind of concept of being a host, being a guest? Is there any kind of alternative ministry that is taught?
Well, it's been quite a while since I was trained for the ministry at this point, but I am involved in some of the teaching at Unitarian College, and I sort of talk about some of these things when I talk about pioneer ministry with the students. And yeah, just try to get ministry students to be in places of reflection around these things, because I think a lot of ministry, and maybe more now than in the past, but maybe always in some ways, is there aren't answers. There are just practices. There aren't like the right way of doing things. There's just the right mindset to come in with doing things and being reflective and asking the question, why are we doing this? And how do we discern a way forward? So I think from my point of view, when I sort of have conversations with ministry students, it's inviting people to be reflective practitioners.
So you'd mentioned earlier about climate activism and how that was one of the first avenues that you went into with your pioneer ministry. You've worked, you said, with Christian Climate Action to develop a monthly prayer vigil now outside of Barclays Bank in Cardiff, and you have started a regular climate cafe. So what specifically about climate activism speaks to your Unitarian values?
I think first I'd want to say there's something of universal values in being concerned with the climate crisis, that any moral person with human values of valuing the human and valuing other kind has reason to be concerned about where we are economically and climate wise in the world. But I would draw upon very much the sense of the siblinghood of humanity is used to be something we talked about very much as the second principle of classical Unitarianism. I would say was the siblinghood, the sisterhood, the brotherhood of humanity, that we are one. There's a oneness of humanity that transcends divisions. Now, there's all kind of nuance to think about with that, but fundamentally, we are interconnected to each other on the globe and into the past and into the future, back to our ancestors and to our descendants as well. So that is our interconnected sense of humanity that is a core Unitarian value, I think, that I would connect with responding to the climate crisis. That we are connected and we are neighbours to people in Tuvalu and Kiribati, Pacific Islands, that are going to cease to exist and are unable to exist with sea level rise with the climate crisis. But also closer to home in the Welsh valleys, there have been floods, and there will be, and in Cardiff, and everywhere. The climate crisis obviously affects everyone and will increasingly do that. At the same time, I'd really understand why people aren't involved in climate activism, because people are in survival mode economically and in all kinds of ways. And in some ways, it's a great privilege to be stepped back and to be concerned about the climate, because it suggests you don't need to be concerned about pressing immediate issues in your life, in your family, in your neighborhood. And many people are concerned with those things, understandably. And that's they should be, and they are, and that's totally understandable. That when there is economic pressure, where there's poverty and unemployment, and the busyness of having a job and a family and what it is to function in the modern world, a lot of people, probably most people, don't have the capacity to deal with that. So that's a sort of a chicken and an egg thing. How do we live in a world where we have more capacity? And how do we create a world where there's more capacity for people to be human? And one of the expressions of being human is to have capacity to care beyond your immediate circle. But when you're pressured by the structures you're around, you can't.
Participating in these prayer vigils for you kind of fulfill that kind of space where it connects you more with those around you. Or how does it make you feel? Like when you do those vigils, I mean, what is it? What are you getting out of it? I mean, not that you're doing it for any kind of reason like that, but
I don't think I've experienced anything as negative as that when we do those. I as I kind of sit and pray and meditate, I sort of try to have a sense of connection to what we're doing it for, and so the connection to everyone else on earth and to the people around us. And it's an interesting experience to be sort of vulnerable, and you hope the person handing out flyers is keeping an eye on things, which is sometimes is me who's the person handing out flyers, and sometimes I'm sitting there silently. Because it feels a bit vulnerable because you're sitting in a very busy city street with your eyes closed. And that feels vulnerable. But also it's I sort of like meditating in busyness. It's something I've done in various contexts over the years. And there is something of kind of feeding off the energy of the busyness of being in the middle of a city. And sometimes either the person I'm handing out flyers to, or if someone else is doing it, but I can sort of hear the conversation if they're being a bit negative or argumentative. Some people just want to have an argument. Most people sort of ignore what's going on in the street and get on with their day. Obviously, that's what most people do. Most of us do most of the time. Sometimes the people who stop are just people who want to have an argument with you, or have a debate, or have their own eccentric views that they want to share. So when you hear that, it's sort of difficult not to respond. And I guess with all of these things, that's a noticing as well, noticing your own anger in the midst of trying to be silent, and noticing a lot of times quiet spiritual practice, even when you're being silent by yourself, enables you to feel your emotions and kind of feel your anger and all kinds of things inside yourself. So it's, in a way, that is often what it is. It's about, the early Christian kind of saints and desert fathers, talked about wrestling with demons, because they went off in the desert and they sat and they prayed by themselves. But they said, I wrestled with the devil for years. And because that's the silence, often you get the anger, the other parts of ourselves, the demons in that metaphorical sense. So yeah, you're always holding that thing, and you trust peace is happening somehow in that. But yeah, sometimes it's not peaceful. Sometimes the seeking of peace is not peaceful. It doesn't feel peaceful.
And that, kind of leads us quite nicely onto the idea of climate cafes, because climate cafes are a place where people can explore their very complex emotions around climate issues. And so you have no experience of leading these very successfully. So tell us a little bit more about what a climate cafe is.
So a climate cafe is sort of developed from the model of a death cafe, which are kind of spaces. I think there are still death cafes that are places where you're allowed to talk about death as a taboo subject. Maybe you don't feel like it's where you can have a polite conversation about death with people, but maybe you want to. And it's a space where you can say, oh, this is an okay space to have this conversation with a cup of tea and a cake, and that's okay. So that model of kind of maybe talking about a taboo subject that is difficult to sort of bring up normally, creating a space for that. That is what a climate cafe is. A space to be listened to talk about climate grief or climate anxiety, or any kind of a range of feelings we might have about the state of the world and what seems to be happening, and how we're responding and not responding to it as a human society. So we've run these for a few years, mainly in a arts centre cafe here in Cardiff. And we hold that space with a sense that we're not, I'm not a therapist, we're not therapists, it's not a therapy group, but there is simply therapeutic, healing, broad value in being in spaces where we listen to each other and are held carefully. And we can't fix people's emotions, and we're not trying to fix people's emotions, but we're letting people know they're not alone. People aren't alone in whatever they're feeling, and however they're feeling, people aren't alone. So very simple. It's a very simple kind of listening circle. We gather, and we often use art, images, for people to help them to think about how they're feeling, if it's a useful thing. And then sort of everyone talks for 5 minutes uninterrupted, just answering that question, how are you feeling? Very simply, how are you feeling? Which, when it's a question asked genuinely, in it being wanting to know the answer, is a powerful question to ask, and sometimes a difficult question to answer. And I think in general, why I think climate cafes are important And I think there's still potential. I don't feel like we've reached, and maybe all climate cafes haven't reached, of finding the importance of our bodies and our emotions, and as a starting point and as a thing to pay attention to. Because I feel like there is less, perhaps, climate denial than there used to be. There's less denial of the facts of climate change than there used to be, maybe in the UK, at least, in my sense of it, in my experience of it. But what there is a kind of an emotional denial of the climate crisis. There is a not allowing us to see the seriousness of the size of it, not allowing it to kind of enter our hearts. And I do that. I think we all do that. And I think we all sometimes need to do that. Sometimes I am 100% in denial about the climate crisis, 100% to get through the day. So it's not that there's one category of people that are climate people and one category of people that are climate denial people. We're all denying and acknowledging back and forth in our understanding. But I think the key thing is that it's not that as a society, as a global society, that we haven't understood the science. It's that we haven't let the science break our hearts. And I think it's that letting it not be about facts. Facts are important. Science is important. I'm a big support, I believe in science very strongly, but change, I think, happens when we kind of allow our bodies and emotions to catch up with facts and live into that. And some people aren't ready for that, or some people aren't in a position to do that. And some people aren't sometimes in a position to do that. And some of us aren't in a position where we're going to be in denial this month. We're going to get through something else. But there's something about being in a gentle and safe way as possible to allow our hearts to break a little bit, to shift ourselves and our world. I think that's what I want to see happen. Maybe not so much for sort of the activists or people like that, but I want our politicians to have hearts that are breaking. And I think that's what's not happening, is that politicians don't have hearts that are breaking. They may say they understand the science and have got this and that policy, but I'll be convinced they're acting well when I'm convinced their hearts are broken.
I mean, that kind of emotional response to an issue is, it's beyond obviously climate. It can obviously spread to any issue that's important to us, be it housing or homelessness or poverty. You also believe firmly in contemplative prayer, and you do some work with that with an activist contemplation group. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to you and how you think these groups might help issues and people going forward?
Well, there's a few different sort of groups that are sort of that I run with the Pioneer Ministry, and they are all sort of new and kind of growing and not quite sure where they're all going. So in a way, I sort of don't want to talk up things that I think, this is sort of an amazing established thing. These are things finding their feet, but that's sort of the nature of it. We have the Spirituality and Climate Sharing Circle, which is similar to a climate cafe, really the same model, but with an invitation to bring spiritual wisdom into that circle and spiritual practice. And that's kind of an interfaith space that's very consciously interfaith. Anyone who has a spirituality or who is open to exploring spirituality. And that has had some kind of rich sharing in it. And we've sort of drawn on people like Joanna Macy, the sort of great Buddhist writer on environmental and climate stuff, who's died fairly recently. So bringing that sort of thought and thinking about and, holding it with each other. And then there's a small group of people who I'm gathering with for kind of contemplative prayer, who are holding some of this stuff, some of this sense of what's going on in the world, and more consciously bringing it to sort of 20 minutes of silent contemplative prayer, which is not narrowly creedally defined, but I think is God-centered, I would say, is consciously God-centered. And so that is one of those spaces that's sort of offering one space to go deeper, and we're able to point. I think what interests me is having models of doing this stuff and having models of spiritual outreach that's not competitive, that is actually interfaith, that to say to people, I believe there's spiritual resource that can help you in spiritual traditions. And if Buddhism is the place that does that for you, then go there, like with my blessing, or with my more than blessing, with my, my strong encouragement, if that is going to help you go and be a Buddhist, while also offering kind of, well, this is I'm holding a Western tradition. I'm holding a kind of Western tradition of contemplation, spirituality, and you're welcome to that too. But yeah, in again, non-attached to outcomes and open and pluralist, but deep, trying to offer the deep places that help us to do this work. So that's again what we're trying to do, and I feel like it's just, I have more questions than answers around all of this, to be honest, and how it will work, and where it will all develop into, I don't know. But those are the questions and kind of instincts I'm exploring.
I mean, you just can imagine it would be amazing getting, people in power involved in something like that, where they were actually letting their heart speak to the issues that are plaguing us. But you had a nice start, though. It sounds like you've got some good shoots of ideas and practice going there. And, your commitment, as many of us know, is strong. And in fact, you took a really strong stance earlier this past summer when you took a bold stance on the right to protest, taking part in a protest supporting Palestine Action, a group that had been controversially sanctioned by the High Court. And during this course of this protest, you were arrested, which is something that you were fully prepared to do. So what made you decide that this was the right to, because basically by supporting Palestine Action, that was a right to protest. It was as much as about obviously supporting Palestine, but also really more about the right to protest. So what made you decide that was the issue that was you're going to stand up for that?
I think my sense of how unjust this law, this prescription is. They never used to use the word prescription. It's sort of always on my mind, my lips every day now, as a banning is the word prescription. That this is kind of a law that is untruthful, that is irrational and illiberal, and because I have respect for the law, because I want the law to be moral. I want the law of the land to, in some broad sense, reflect what is right and what is wrong, and what is moral and what is immoral. That requires me to point out and to protest when law is not consistent with morality and with truth, fundamentally. So the protest, I took part in, and that thousands have taken part in, since is about protesting the genocide in Gaza, the fact that, which we hope has slowed down, stopped, whatever it is today, at time of recording. Who knows how things change, but we hope is a bit better now at the moment. But has been a very serious time of of what seems to be genocide, what seems to be war crimes. And it is the responsibility of humanity to seek to prevent genocide as best we can. And the protest I took part in was against genocide because, I opposed genocide. It's an obvious statement to make. And I opposed war, and I opposed terrorism. I oppose violence. I'm a non-violent person opposed to violence. But Palestine Action are not terrorists by any international standard, by any standard of international law, by any common sense definition of terrorism, as, the targeting of civilians to kill and bomb civilians with violence, to do violence against civilians for your aim. It is not true that is what they are doing. And for 20 years, I've preached sermons from every now and again on peace and on non-violent direct action, as a spiritual practice, that there is a spiritual tradition of non-violent direct action, of non-compliance with law, of civil disobedience from, going back a long time, but certainly from Henry David Thoreau, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Greenham Common. There's lots of things we could talk about, and I've preached about such things. And I've spoken about such things as a minister, and I've, preached from the prophet Isaiah, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. They shall beat swords into plowshares. That means taking a weapon and beating it and making it out of use so that it can no longer be a weapon. And that is the prophet Isaiah, the great Jewish prophetic tradition of justice and peace. And as I understand it, this law makes that sermon illegal. It makes preaching such a sermon, saying that a group are beating swords into plowshares, it makes preaching that sermon illegal. And my sense of freedom of speech, of freedom of protest, and most significantly, freedom of religion, to me means that offends me, and that is not acceptable in a liberal democracy that allows such freedoms. And so to believe and to clink our glasses, as we Unitarians do, to civil and religious freedom the world over means standing up for it when civil and religious freedom is threatened. And so after, preaching a lot of sermons about these kind of things, this seemed, and having the ability to do it. And, if I'd been busy that Saturday, I wouldn't have done it. It was, if I had a previous arrangement, it wouldn't have quite happened. But there was no reason not to do it. And there was every moral reason to do it. And when a government crosses that kind of a line, it needs to be challenged straight away, because if you wait, it might be too late. If authoritarianism grows, if you don't sort of challenge when something illiberal happens, and you have to give a no to that. Because if you wait to give that no, it might be a no that's too late. Because it's a no, you no longer have the power to say the no if you don't say the no as soon as something like that happens.
Yeah, I mean, and I really do hope you've had, a good amount of support within the Unitarian community. I know, from the Social Justice Network, all of us were behind you. A bunch of us went to, much of it was the same, it might have been the same day actually that you were arrested in London. They were having a similar type of protest. And while none of us were as brave as you to actually get handcuffs on ourselves, but we did stand in a circle of witness to the group, the people that were doing that. And it was really humbling to see people that were able to go to that level. And so was it at all scary or anything, or were you just so committed that it just kind of, it was okay? How did you feel about it when it was happening? I
find myself resisting words like brave and words like scary, because we shouldn't be afraid of our own government. And I don't want us to be getting in a place where we're afraid of our own government. Someone standing up. Our government should be afraid of us in a democracy fundamentally, not in a violent way, but in a sense we might vote them out. Government should be in service of people and worried about whether they're doing the right thing for the people. The people should not be intimidated by their governments. Government should be, worried about, doing right things for their people and getting voted out if they do the wrong thing. So I always want to kind of resist that. But yeah, it was, we sat 13 of us in Cardiff outside the BBC building in the city centre in a line, and we sat in silence for an hour, and I prayed, I closed my eyes and prayed again in that sort of space, sitting in silence and praying while holding a sign. And the police were around us for a while. And it was somewhat intimidating. They all kind of lined up at one point in front of us and then began to take us away. And they dragged me away, which I hadn't really made a definite decision one way or the other about what, if I was going to do that. I thought it was more likely than not that I would be arrested. I wasn't 100% sure. I thought it was difficult to know because this was the second weekend where this was a reality. So we didn't know how exactly everything was going to be implemented and how this was going to be policed. I thought there was sort of a 60% chance of getting arrested doing this. I thought maybe South Wales Police would take a different approach to the Met Police, which there has been variation across the UK on policing. But I was not going to consent to the arrest because I believe the arrest is not a moral act, not a legal act, I think, but I'm not, that will be sorted out by legal people, but it's certainly not a moral act. Therefore, I was not going to use 1 ounce of my own muscle strength to help them to do that. I was going to sit believing in my body that I had freedom, that I lived in a liberal democracy, that I could sit here and do this. And if they thought, oh, we don't live in a liberal democracy, that's for them to take that action. My body is not going to help them affirm that belief that we don't live in a liberal democracy where people have freedom of speech. So yeah, so I was, dragged off. It was okay. I wasn't injured in any way. I got no sort of complaints in that sense. And taken to a cell where I was for 27 hours. And I think that's the same for all the 13 people arrested for Cardiff, more than this kind of standard 24 hours. And our homes were raided, and my phone was taken, my computer was taken. I still haven't got those back. A poster saying Free Palestine in my kitchen was taken, as if that's a crime. And yeah, that's been the sort of the difficult thing, was being recovering from that and being worried about my cat, the police coming in the middle of the night, to raid my home. But in the cell, I mainly felt freedom. I mainly felt it was a free experience. In fact, it was an experience of, I'm still have a sense of being sure that I'm doing the right thing, even in the face of kind of an intimidating system that makes you think you're being naughty. But, it felt okay. It felt okay. And I sang hymns. I sang Teze hymns, and I sang Freedom is Coming, the South African apartheid era song. And I sang My Life Flows On, an endless song above Earth's lamentation. And it felt like this is what it is for this to be my faith. It felt very sure about that. But it's all very silly, basically. It's a very serious, but it's all very silly that we're in this position. And I keep coming back to, it's very serious, but it's also incredibly silly.
I mean, it really is unfortunate that we are with that by standing up to what is obviously horrendous wrongs, that people are wasting time wasting resources by being arrested, and all the permutations of how that impacts your life and our system, as it were, as well. But and as you mentioned, it does sound like that it was in a way a spiritual event for you, or you allowed your spirituality to strengthen and ground you while you were going through that. So, I'm assuming that you're going to agree with the fact that these kind of participating in these kind of protests and these kind of movements can be very spiritually enriching. Sorry, that's a statement more than a question, because I can just see you nodding. But yeah, it's one thing that I find on the smaller things, like the silent vigils, for example, I find that much more moving. Although it is also very, very moving to be in a march with hundreds of, tens of thousands of people, and knowing you're all there for the same reason. So I can absolutely 100% recommend any kind of engagement like that. So yeah, on that little tangent, thank you so much for speaking about that, because I know a lot of people we're very curious to know how you're getting on with it and what it was like for you. And so I think you helped us understand that a little bit more. So we'll close, because I know there's going to be, we'll see how long this gets edited down to, but we had a lot to talk about today. My final question for you is, if you could wave your magic wand and change one thing about the Unitarian world, what would it be?
I think there's all kinds of things I might be tempted to say of process and procedure and things that are frustrating, but that's kind of, maybe those things don't matter, and that's those things always exist. I think I'd just like us to pray more, quite honestly. I would just like us to pause, to stop, to do spiritual practice on a daily basis, and to see ourselves not as a kind of less effective Amnesty International, but understanding, what it is to be spiritual community, to offer resource of spirituality into those to help those who know that there are things that are wrong with the world, that this is a, beautiful, wonderful world, but with so many kind of structural injustices, and wanting to speak to that, but not sort of seeing our role as just being another kind of organization saying the same thing, but seeing us, understanding ourselves as a spiritual community, the pause to notice our bodies, And Art Lester's sermon from 2008, Art Lester, who died very recently, very sadly, great spiritual giant in this movement, in my opinion. I come back and back again to his anniversary sermon when he just said, are we praying about it? Brothers and sisters and siblings, have we stopped to pray? That's what I return to.
No, fantastic. And it's wonderful to mention Art Lester. That gives us an opportunity to think about him, and perhaps we'll be able to even link to that if it's available somewhere. All right. Well, we'll say thank you very much, Stephen Lingwood. It was lovely to talk to you today.
Thank you.
Standing as people so bold, walking into the unknown. Whatever will come, we know we're ready for the changes. It's darkest before the dawn.